So it's only been 2 months since I made my last video on optimistic UI and Laravel Livewire, kind of figuring out how Caleb Porzio did it in a tweet that he made. I made a video about it you can find here. But optimistic UI is still being talked about in the Twitterverse and just in the web dev world in general. And how do you make better experiences for users? And since we're using Laravel Livewire and AlpineJS, how do you do that with those tools? So the folks at Titan actually released a blog post on optimistic UI tricks for Livewire and Alpine. I haven't been able to read it fully yet, so I want to create a video, give my thoughts on it, as well as just learn something together on how can we do optimistic UI better for our users using Livewire and Alpine. So, optimistic UI tricks for Livewire and Alpine. This is written by Tony Messias and Omar Arita, so follow them on Twitter. I think I just started following them today just because of this blog post. So, it was released today, fresh off the press. There's been a lot of debate in the last few weeks on the merits of building web apps with HTML over the wire versus using popular JavaScript libraries like Vue and React, and how that choice affects the experiences of end users and developers. In this post, we'll talk through some optimistic UI tricks we apply when using Laravel with Livewire and Alpine to capture the best of both worlds, instantaneous feeling actions on the UI like what you'd expect from a single page app, combined with the developer experience you may prefer in Livewire and Alpine. Let's dive in. I'm excited because I have loved Livewire from when I started using it in Livewire 2, and Livewire 3 makes it even easier. Admittedly, I am not an expert in Alpine. I just kind of use it just because it's kind of mingled and interconnected with Livewire. And I know a lot of folks who do use it, and I kind of just follow their example. But even one of the earlier videos that I made was ways to make a Livewire app feel like a SPA, a single page app. And I love those extra little UI tricks, like with Livewire Wire Navigate, where you can kind of see when a page is trying to be loaded. It's those little things that make users feel like you're on a modern app, in my opinion. So what's an optimistic UI? Optimistic UI tricks help us maximize perceived performance. The perception of how quickly and smoothly pages load and respond to user interaction is even more important than the actual time required to fetch the resources. Interesting. While you may not be able to physically make your site run faster, you may well be able to improve how fast it feels for your users. That's a good point. It looks like this comes from Mozilla's page as well, but that's a good point. Like, even if your users have slow internet, if they know that something is happening behind the scenes and you're actually actively telling them that, that's why loading spinners got to be so popular. I think, we've kind of moved away from that. And we're like, okay, just do everything on the server, but you still need to tell your users that something is happening. You can rely on the browser for that, but some browsers, like some people just don't like the feel that it feels slow because my browser is taking forever to load the next page. So that's why loading spinners came to be, of like, okay, we're telling the user that we're loading this information. We're telling the user that something's happening. They know that something's happening, not just because the browser is loading, but there's also something else happening. And Livewire can't help with that, but I think we're going to get into this even more. So starting from first principles, getting to instant interactions is easy when there's no server. Simple counter serves as a perfect example. Try it. Bam. Yep. As you can see, that's just in, I'm not going to open that up, but that's just in the browser. It's just the client. So when you click the counter increments, the UI is updated instantly. No server is involved in the interaction, and all of the state is managed on the client side. So now let's imagine that the counter has to make an API call to let the server know it has been incremented, and then wait for the server to confirm that the increment was successful before reflecting the new state on the user's UI. So waiting for the server to respond. Okay, I love that they're showing these examples. This is becoming really popular in blog posts, which I'm all for. I'm not someone who likes writing as a medium first. That's why I'm making a video about this blog post. But I love the extra thought and attention that's put into a blog post. So waiting for the server to respond. Like if I was to try to clicking this multiple times, you can see that I clicked it 3 times and only happen once because we're waiting for the server to respond before it actually registers another click. So it adds a few hundred milliseconds of lag to the user's perceived performance. It's important to note that the slowness here isn't because we have a server receiving API calls, it's because we're waiting for the server to respond before updating the UI. What if we didn't wait for the response and instead optimistically assume that the request would succeed? That's an optimistic UI. Okay, so that's a great definition there. And if you don't know what optimistic UI is, now you know. It's saying, we're waiting for the server to respond, but we're going to update the client as if the server has already responded. And the optimistic part is we're just saying, hey, we're not going to assume that it's going to fail 90% of the time or whatever that percentage might be for the task that you're doing. 99% of the time, it's probably going to succeed. If you're removing state, let's say you're deleting an email, for example, most of the time when you click on delete, it's going to succeed most of the time, unless there's some weird error like you lose connection or, the server's overloaded, whatever that might be. So why not just show it being deleted before you actually get a response saying, hey, this actually was deleted? Okay. So ultimately, an optimistic UI aims to minimize the client's reliance on the server's response so that user interactions feel instant. So sync in server state. Okay, yeah, so I'm clicking multiple times. Sync in server state, 22. I'm actually curious what this one is doing here, so let's take a look. Simple counter with JavaScript. So it's basically saying increment local counter immediately, clear the previous timeout if there's any, and then set timeout to simulate the API call. Okay, I get it. Okay, so it's basically waiting for that the click to stop happening, and then after it's storing all of that, and then it's pushing it in. Okay, so let's move on to a real world example using Livewire and Alpine. Awesome, I love this. Real world, I'm curious. Okay, we run a form as a service product. Okay, that's awesome. I didn't know the Titan team did that. So applying optimistic UI, I'm reading ahead. Applying optimistic UI techniques in Livewire and Alpine. We run a form as a service product for forms called Field Goal. The app initially used Vue on the front end, but we recently migrated it to use Livewire and Alpine. I'm actually curious, other than maybe they, I don't know too many people on the Titan team, closely, but I'm curious as to what was the decision moving from Vue, I assume with inertia on the front end, to Livewire and Alpine. Maybe just to try it out, just to learn new things. But yeah, I love what we're diving into. Okay, so if you haven't checked it out, check out Field Goal by the Titan team. Awesome. So things worked well, but the UX wasn't great on the inbox screen. So we were trying to stay on the server side as much as we could. That's one point, this point right here, we were trying to stay on the server side as much as we could. That's one point that I really love about Livewire, because I was a front end person first. I did JavaScript, I did Next.js, I did React, I did Svelte, Vue even a little bit. I loved doing as much stuff as I could on the client and not the other way around. When I moved into Laravel, when I moved into Livewire, it kind of forced me to say, okay, what actually do I need to run on the client? And I don't do a great job at this, but Livewire also helps say, do you actually need a Livewire component for that? Do you need to interact with the server, or can it be done through a separate page? Does the form need to be on this page and receive information, or can that just be a separate page altogether? Something like, let's say you're editing a blog post. Do you need to edit that inline, in that sense, receive information, make it editable, and then save it without leaving that page? Or can it just be a different page altogether? It kind of forces you to think, how much do we need to stay on the server versus what little can we do with the server, But we pushed it too far to the point that actions felt noticeably less snappy. Okay, those few hundred milliseconds of network costs for each action were hurting the user experience, so we set out to tweak the implementation. I have this in a couple of my products that I have as well. I have loading spinners, for example, and sometimes I don't even have loading spinners, but if I was to click a button, I have to wait for, let's say I have this, you can set the order in one of my products. You can set the order of what each is displayed. So I have little arrow buttons on the side that move up each element. Let's say there's 5 elements. If it was on 4, instead of clicking and dragging, it's just little buttons. It was my way out of not having to click and drag. And so if you click the button, you have to wait a little bit before it actually moves into the 4th position. It's not the best, but it's not the worst either, I guess. So it looks like, is this a animated picture or not? Okay. Users of field, there we go. Users of field will often go through their inbox and archive form submissions they've already responded to, or mark a submission as spam if it somehow got through our spam filters. So this is what that interaction looked like on a local machine, throttling to emulate a fast 3G connection. Okay, so they're like clicking on archive multiple times. You have to wait until like it actually is completely deleted. Okay, yeah. It's easy to notice the lag between clicking the archive button and the UI arriving at its final end state, along with the fact that the transition isn't as smooth as it should be. We wanted to focus our energy on optimizing the inbox UX so that taking an action like archiving a submission would make the item instantly disappear from the inbox and then immediately focus the next item in the inbox. Okay, so it's not just remove or archiving it. Now it's also focusing the next item, which is a little bit trickier as well. So here's some tips and tricks we apply to improve the perceived performance of the app. Optimistically updating the UI using wire loading. Tip number 1. So Livewire allows us to apply some loading states. This is what I showed in my optimistic UI video on Livewire. Whenever specific actions are triggered, one of the loading state options allows us to remove an element while Livewire action is in progress by adding a wire loading.remove to the element we want to hide. Optionally, we can specify the target actions that this behavior should apply to with the wire target attribute. Our first attempt to improve the inbox UI UX was inspired by Josh Siri. That's me. I've never been in a blog post before. This is really cool. Especially to be like next to Caleb Porzio in a blog post. I'm kind of speechless. Okay. I wonder if this is to my tweet. Yes, looks like it is. Yeah. So Caleb Porzio tweeted out this thing of like, hey, here's optimistic UI without having to touch JavaScript, because previously what I was doing with optimistic UI was kind of syncing that client side with data on an Alpine object, and then with timeouts, basically pushing that back to the server behind the scenes. But this wire loading remove was an optimistic UI trick that I kind of showed a video on of use the remove element to optimize it based off the optimized way that this state should look, and then target it based off that thing. So if we were, if this was removing a email, then we're archiving it on that click during loading. So remove that email during the click and target the specific email that was actually clicked to archive. I'm guessing that's not going to work specifically for them. If I had to think ahead, I'm guessing it didn't work specifically for them because there's one other extra element that they need, in the sense of they're now probably focusing onto the next email on the list, and that also triggers a whole new state. So you're kind of having to do multiple things, if I had to guess. So our attempt looks something like this. For each submission, wire key, wire loading, remove this based off of its moving to archive. Although this helped and would have likely been sufficient for a simpler use case. Yeah, the wire loading remove is very simple in its nature, in the sense that it's specific for things like that element is now removed from the screen, or we're adding a new element to the screen. Although this helped with a simpler use case, it wasn't enough in our particular scenario. We could see the archive submission disappearing from the list instantly, but the next submission wasn't being automatically selected. I am kind of proud of myself for getting that right. We applied the same trick to the details section, and the story is similar. Users would see the empty box until they get a response from the server with the next item selected on the list and its details. The issue here is that the selected submission logic happens on the server side. Okay, yeah. Also, we have multiple actions, and Livewire doesn't support targeting multiple actions with params using wire target at the moment. I bet they said at the moment because if Caleb Porzio was to read this blog post, he probably, just because he's insanely smart and talented, just is going to find a way to make that happen. So furthermore, since users can achieve a submission and then undo the action, there isn't an easy for us to track the submissions which have been archived and unremove them using wire loading. These issues didn't exist in the Vue version because all the interactions were happening on the client side. Luckily, we can fix it without introducing a new tool since Livewire now ships with Alpine out of the box. Great. And in my video, I didn't figure this part out. I might have. I can't remember. I don't think I figured this part out in the video. But Caleb mentioned how he uses Alpine to reset the to-do list input box. So it was basically, instead of having to kind of wait for the server to respond to reset the state, he was just using Alpine to reset the state on click. And I'm wondering if it might be something similar to this. So on click of archive, you can still remove that element, but use Alpine to automatically select the next form in the submissions. Okay, tip number 2, minimize network calls with client-side state. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, one of the things that I think is interesting here is that within the Vue version, all the interactions were happening on the client side. That's typically, for most people who are coming from the JavaScript world and haven't done anything, server first, that's typically what you would reach for. Is, okay, if we're archiving this, let's remove it from the state, and then after that's removed, then we can push it to the server from the background. Where within Livewire and just within any kind of like server first rendered application, usually you think the other way around. Hey, we need to remove this from the server so that it is removed from the client. So it's just a different way of thinking through things and therefore different ways of solving problems, like with Alpine. Okay, as we said earlier, this page was heavily reliant on server-side state. Selecting one submission was done with a Livewire action that set the selected submission state on the back end, then re-renders that component, which display the details of the selected submission in the details section. All that works well on local. It feels magical. Take a look. Okay, so they're selecting it. Set the submission state on the back end, re-renders the components. They're selecting it, and it's displaying the information in that page. As soon as we added latency to the game, it doesn't feel so magical anymore. That makes sense because it's waiting for that information to then be loaded so that they can display it over here on the side. You can see form.show, and then it finally finalizes. This isn't Livewire's fault. That's something to note. All of this isn't server-side fault. It's not Hotwire's fault. It's not Livewire's fault. It's not LiveVue's fault. This is just what the problems that you need to solve end up being when you think server first. We shouldn't be using server-side state for this kind of interaction in the first place. There you go. We fixed this by moving the submissions and selected state to the client side. So div wire, ignore that. That's basically just telling it that we don't want to try to re-render this component when this happens. We're ignoring that component while the server-side interactions are happening. Xdata submissions, and this is the great part about Alpine with Livewire, is you kind of just have these directives that link the two things together. So this is just saying selected submission is null, selected submission. Okay, so it's basically whatever it's setting the state of submissions to this submissions within JavaScript. So it's saying, hey, grab this submissions from the PHP element, the state that's being loaded in. And then we have this on initialized. We can set selected submission equals submissions versus array or null. And then selected submission function is changing the submission. So we're not even using entangle here. Okay. Yeah. All the interactivity for selecting submissions, including keyboard navigation. Ooh, interesting. Happens entirely on the client side. Also, we no longer rely on Livewire re-renders here. We're delegating that part entirely to Alpine. Instead of using something like wire click to trigger server-side actions like this. So wire click, select submission, and then you're changing the submission in that state. We now need to handle that in Alpine. So submission and submissions. So X on click, select submission. That's running the function that was initialized up here, select submission. Okay, and this move to archive method would be on the Alpine component, and it would look something like this. So if not selected submission return, then we can wire call this move to archive. So basically, that way, this wire call is basically being able to call any wire method without having to do some fancy thing of like doing API calls in that sense. Luckily, Livewire and Alpine mix together really well. It's almost like they were built by the same person. Laughing face emoji. Okay, selecting a submission now takes place entirely on the client side without waiting for a response, and it feels super snappy. I love that because it replaces the way of thinking. So instead of having to grab that state and then render that state on the client side based off of what you're selecting and that state living on the server side, just move it all to the client. And Alpine works great. And I think the kind of unsung heroes here are this await wire call, which I'm assuming is that move to archive method, but the selected submissions is all happening on the client side. So it's gathering that data from the server, but it's just loading it when the component is actually loaded. However, the actions still wait for the network response before updating the UI. Okay, so let's see if we can improve that. So the actions still wait for the network response before updating the UI. Okay, that makes sense. I think in terms of like archiving is what they're saying. Optimistically updating the UI through client-side state management. The issue now is that to update the UI, we're still waiting for the Livewire action call to happen. In our case, the result of these actions would be the same. Remove the selected submission from the list, select the next one, if any. So yeah, the archive feature. They did have the wire call archive. I wonder if they're going to kind of expand upon that to the await method. We don't need to wait for the response here. We can optimistically update the UI by assuming the action will work. So yeah, they had the await wire call. So that was basically just saying that move to archive. They didn't change this too much from what you were doing with just wire click. Now they're moving it to a promise. So wire call, move to archive. Again, it's incredibly awesome that we can do some stuff like this in an Alpine, component, if you will. Okay, and then we can await the promise and const promise and then await the promise. That's it actually. The UI will be instantly rendered, updated when the request is sent to the server. Since we no longer rely on the re-renders, we can update the UI to reflect the intention of the action the user took on the submission. This is a snippet of the actual code. In our case, we're also recording the most recent action taken to revert it by either clicking on the undo button in the success notification or pressing the keyboard shortcut. But the idea is the same. Here's how it currently feels. See that archive? It's not actually completed yet, and now it's completed. So now it's actually removed from the server. Archive, submission will be moved back. Okay, so they're probably doing it, since they're keeping all that state on the client now, if you were to archive it and then undo it, it's just canceling that submission to archive it to the server. So now the server isn't going to be like, oh, I'm deleting it or I'm archiving it and then I'm bringing it back. That's the benefit of doing it in the client for something like this, because you can be optimistic about maybe the user's changing their mind, or maybe they want to do 3 of them at once or something like that. Okay, tip number 4, introducing artificial slowness. Ooh, this is an interesting one. I'm curious about this. Can the UI ever be too fast? Yes. After we applied these optimistic UI tricks to Field Goals inbox, we found, for example, that if the user held down the archive keyboard shortcut for a bit too long, they'd end up archiving multiple submissions since the action is instant. That's interesting. It's interesting that a lot of times, we solve all of these problems for the user of, okay, we're doing everything on the server. Now we need it to be faster and kind of show them on the client that everything's happening and they can do it instantly. But sometimes instant is almost too much. It's like this gratification piece of now it's almost like too fast where it feels weird. You've been on those websites where like you're clicking around and you're like, this feels off because it's just too fast. There's no like loading spinners or like slowness as I'm scrolling or like, updating information on the server. So it feels like maybe it's not actually saving properly. In my instance, in my case, I've been on several apps or websites where that's the case, where I'm like, I'm deleting something and it's so quick that sometimes I don't know if I'm actually synced with the server. It feels like maybe this is just all client stuff. And if I was to refresh, I would lose everything. Especially if you don't have any kind of information saying, hey, that was saved or like updated or any kind of prompts or visual notification like that. Okay. After we apply these optimistic UI tricks to Field Goal's inbox, found for example, yep, okay. We need to slow things down just enough to add friction between actions. Luckily, Alpine has 2 built-in modifiers to help us. Again, because now you're all doing this in Alpine on the client side, now we can use Alpine's directives instead of having to worry about wires pulling directives or wires debounce directives. Built-in modifiers, debounce and throttle. Both the debounce and throttle modifiers default to a 250 millisecond debounce or throttle interval, respectively. You can tweak this higher or lower by doing something like debounce.300 milliseconds, throttle 700 milliseconds. We experimented with both options and chose to apply Alpine's built-in throttle at the default 250 milliseconds interval to solve this problem. We decided against debounce because it adds a leading delay, which makes it seem like the action is slower, perceived performance downgrade. Okay, but throttle added a trailing delay, which means that the first action is still instant, but the next action will face friction, which is what we want. Interesting. Okay, yeah. Exile and click, .throttle. It's as simple as that. It's helpful to try the app and see how it feels after applying optimistic UI tricks. Sometimes as users, we subconsciously expect a bit of a lag and a visible render to tell our brains that our intended actions worked. Great, I'm glad we agree. After applying some optimistic UI tricks, you may notice some areas needing more explicit feedback to tell the users that their action took effect. So tip number 5, choosing when not to apply optimistic UI. Okay, yeah. Optimistic UI tricks help us maximize the user's perceived performance, and that's really important when we're creating a highly interactive experience. We started this refactor because, okay, here we go. Here's a refactor reasoning. As heavy users of Field Goal, we weren't satisfied with how the inbox felt to us. Or actually, this refactor might be after they moved to Livewire. This is what they weren't happy with the optimistic UI piece. On the other hand, Field Goal has other pages that are much less interactive. Our settings and billing pages, for example, aren't particularly exciting or interactive. Could we invest time into making the change password experience seem faster through optimistic UI tricks? Probably. But it's hard to justify that investment, so we're very content to continue using Livewire for the entirety of the pages with very little or no Alpine involved. I love that. And that's just what I was saying. Like, sometimes you don't need to have everything be perfect is a weird word. You don't need to have everything be as fleshed out as you think it needs to be. So every single interaction within your application for things like a change password flow doesn't need to have those optimistic UI updates. But can you give your users a better experience for the things that might need those updates? Yes, you can. And the good thing is we didn't move out of the tall stack. So this was, I assume Tailwind, Alpine, Livewire, and Laravel. They didn't have to add a different component or a different element or a different, they didn't have to reach out and go back into view for this specific element. It can all be done with this. It's just deciding which parts need to do it and then which parts can you remove from the server, but still have the user experience the things that they need to experience. An optimistic UI really shines with interactivity. When you want users to get into a flow state and spend a lot of time on a particular part of the app, that's a great place to invest in optimistic UI. I agree, but it's okay to keep it simple with just SSR for the more boring bits where the user doesn't get more value from the optimistic UI experience. Conclusions. And I guess like a piece here is like, yes, if your whole thing was archiving form submissions, which that's probably like a good part of it because you want that to feel snappy and as fast for their users and even the users of their users, because you're like, okay, I want to send this out to my users as a form. I want it to feel fast. So if it feels fast to me, I'm going to feel comfortable sending this to my users to collect submissions. But I doubt you're going to keep users or even gain users if your reset password is just a hair faster or it appears faster or even the login page. Like no one really cares because you're in an app because the app solves the problem that you want. So spend time on the problems that it actually solves and how those problems are interacting with your users. So conclusions. There are many different approaches to building user interfaces on the web, and each approach has its own trade-offs and usefulness in a given situation. JS and HTML over the wire have both seen a lot of success in the real world, and they each deserve their own well-earned props. However, they can be even more powerful when wielded together. Can I get an amen in the chat? Optimistic UI offers us a way to maximize perceived performance and create immersive experiences on the web. We focused on how these tricks play out in Livewire and Alpine, which helped us capture the best of both worlds. Instantaneous feeling actions on the UI like what you'd expect from an SPA through Alpine, combined with the developer experience you look for in Livewire. That's a great tag. That's a great tag. That should be on like a t-shirt. These tricks aren't unique to Laravel and Alpine either. There we go. Optimistic UI concepts can be applied to any stack, whether you're building with Vue, React, Hotwire, or Livewire. And that's a thing that people, I think, are missing in this whole conversation is optimistic UI is easier in client-side libraries, Vue, React, Svelte. But that doesn't mean you also don't have ways of optimizing that UI from a server side in those languages as well, where maybe what happens when it's been rejected, or what happens when you're sending multiple events to the server. Do they get clashed? Are you queuing up those events? Maybe like within Laravel, within Livewire, it's a lot easier to say, okay, if someone is saying, I want to click on this button, it's going to send an email. Now all of a sudden you can queue that up. So it's not trying to complete that expensive request on the server before you're actually showing the user what's happening. That debalance is a great way of also, making sure that works properly and is displaying to users, hey, not everything is happening right away after that first one. Okay, you don't always need an optimistic UI though, and it sure isn't free. One thing we didn't cover here is that you now have to handle some new edge cases. Like what happens when the action fails. It might be easy to overlook these kind of issues and sometimes tricky to implement compensating actions. When your app is focused on interactivity, these optimistic UI tricks can be a noticeable delight to the user experience. But it's okay to keep things simple for pages that don't need this level of interactivity, like a settings page. We hope you enjoyed reading this post. Drop us a line on Twitter @TitanCo if you want to ask questions, share more optimistic UI tips, or say hi. I believe I'm following them, but I am. You should follow them, as well as the whole team of Titan. So Tony Messias, and I forget who else was the author. Let's see. Omar Rita. Perfect. So yes, make sure you follow them. Follow the Titan team. Matt Stauffer, who leads Titan. Big fan of them and their work. Okay, where were we? If you want to ask questions, share more optimistic UI tips, or say hi. Shout outs. A big shout out to Caleb Porzio and Josh Siri, who recently posted content that inspired some of our internal conversations regarding optimistic UI. I appreciate that. I'm still so shocked. I'm placed next to Caleb Porzio. That's pretty crazy. But yeah, follow Caleb Porzio if you have not. Obviously, he's the author of this whole blog post, technically, because if Livewire and Alpine didn't exist, then this blog post wouldn't exist. So, and my videos wouldn't exist. So, follow Caleb Porzio. Caleb Porzio tweeted a demo of how to use wire loading remove as a way to instantly hide a to-do item that is marked complete on the client side without waiting for the server to respond. I also made a great video. Wow. I also made a video about this, so you can find that here as well. So thanks so much, Titan team, for shouting me out. I appreciate that. But yeah. Read through this blog post. If you are building within the tall stack, within Livewire, within Alpine, there are some great tips here and some that I'm probably going to implement in some of my projects moving forward as well. But the biggest thing that I think that I like, focusing on for stuff like this is when you are building in server-side components, where you have Livewire, you're waiting for the server to actually complete things before you're actually showing it to the user, you have to start thinking, what things don't actually need to be on the server? I made a video all about that where I said there's some things that you don't need to be on the server, and sometimes we kind of conflate the two of everything should be on the client or everything should be on the server. Just like this blog post said, it doesn't need to be that way. JS and server side and all of that stuff were created for a reason. So just think about your users, think about what kind of experience you want to give to them, and then realize that there's no one way to solve all of that. But you're giving your users the best possible experience that represent what your application is, what you solve, and how it can solve it for them, then you're doing a good job. So keep creating.